It's a little daunting to get started with webxr. So here we're just going to go over a really straightforward setup. To start off with, we are going to talk about setting up a server. And so we're going to go over the options, talk about which one's the easiest to get started with. Then we're going to go over some dev tools. So how you actually set up your development environment. And then we're just going to show you how you can do live editing in AR with Chrome dev tools. And that's very powerful because that means that your turnaround times on building apps can be very quick. So let's get started. Because webxr requires a web page to work, we need to think about hosting options, and there are a huge number of different places that you can host your website. We're going to loosely categorize these different hosting solutions into 3 categories and then just talk about their pros and cons. So to start off with, we have full cloud situations, and so these tend to be used by large companies and are often used by smaller companies too, but they are really important when you need scalability. So if you expect whatever you're going to be using to get very large, then they would be useful in that case. They also have a bunch of different services that are all intermixed together. So sometimes you have to use them because some of your data or some of your other resources are already on them. So if you are already on them, then sometimes you need to stay on them. They also do have a lot of free services too. So I think AWS and Cloud and probably Azure they have a free tier, which they give out free resources for. So if you don't have a lot of money, sometimes the free options are actually good enough. If you want to spend money, these tend to get very expensive very quickly. So people can rack up really large bills on full cloud services. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that can end up spending more than you anticipate on them. Virtual private machines are basically getting a small chunk of a server and then you can do whatever you want with it. So they have a lot of flexibility to them, but they do require a little bit of extra configuration usually. So sometimes you have to set up your own SSL certificates and kind of sometimes have to set up Nginx and if Node or some sort of application server. So they have a lot of configuration that you need to do on your own, but that can be very powerful. And you need to do things like web sockets, or if you want your server to be more dynamic and do computations on a server, they are usually a very good option, and they are also usually relatively cheap. So they tend to have a lower price point than full cloud situations. You should do all the price checking on your own though, because a lot of these things change. The pricing changes very rapidly. So sometimes, yeah. So static site generators, the static refers to what the server is doing. So if there's no database or any sort of information on your server, then these can be really good options, and they're oftentimes very inexpensive. So yeah, and they tend to also scale relatively well because it's very easy to serve static resources versus dynamic resources. These, even though they're really cheap, they can oftentimes scale a lot better than the virtual private machines. Those ones tend to, you need to think a little bit more about bottlenecks when you come to virtual private machines. So yeah, I think to get started with, there are all these options, but I think the best one for a beginner is actually, this is going to be really weird for people in like most other situations, but I think GitHub Pages is probably the one that makes the most sense. And so I'm just going to list some of the pros and cons of GitHub Pages. So to start off with the cons, I really don't like that it's run with Microsoft. I think Microsoft has a bit of a monopoly, so that's a negative. It's also can't do dynamic things very well with it. So later on, we're going to be doing some stuff with WebSockets and stuff. Also, if you have any sort of like secret plans, it's not very good because it's all out in the open on GitHub Pages. So no secret plans. But then let's move on to the pros. So the advantages is it's really easy to get started. It's free. It's really shareable. So if you have any sort of problems, you can get someone to help you much easier than some of the other forms. The SSL certificate is set up automatically, so there's no need to fool around with Let's Encrypt or anything else. It tends to be very fast, and it can be tightly integrated with other projects. So, and in the future, if you are running on one of these other services, it's really easy to pull code from GitHub into other locations. If later on you decide you need to move to a different option, you can clone things off of GitHub very easily, where sometimes it's a little bit of a headache to move things around. But once it's on GitHub, it's very easy to pull off of GitHub. And then finally, it's Microsoft, and I don't like Microsoft. I'm still recommending them, which is kind of a sign that like it's probably a good solution. Like VS Code. You start a GitHub Pages website, basically you just need a GitHub account, and then you have to create a new repository, and you can basically name it whatever you want. Once you have that set up, it should be public, so I don't think you can do this with a private repository, but once it's set up, you can go to the settings, and you can go to the pages portion of the settings and add the main as the source. And if you have an index page, it will use the index page as the entry point into pages. So having something called index.html. And so then once you have the GitHub page started, it usually does take a few moments. So I think it's about 30 seconds to a minute for GitHub pages to reload. But once it's set up, it will have an SSL certificate, and you can basically just write whatever you want now. But having a blank page isn't super useful, so we're just going to use copy and paste to paste in some code from somewhere else. Okay, so once we have just a very simple AR scene set up with Three.js and webxr, we can just get started with it. With the Android development bridge on the terminal, you basically just write in adb start server, and then that's good to go. In order to enable the developer tools on an Android, generally what you do is you go to the settings, you go to the system information, then you go to software information, and then you click on build number 7 times, and then it will enable the developer tools from there. So it's a little bit of an odd thing, but yeah, that's how it's done. We have the bridge set up, so the Android developer bridge. We have our dev tools working, and if we connect our USB to our computer, the next thing that we can do is if we go to inspect Chrome, if we have a web page open on our cell phone, we should just be able to see that on the inspect Chrome, and we should be able to start our scene. So now that we've set up GitHub and we've set up the dev tools, we can quickly see how powerful these dev tools are. So let's just move on over to our dev tab and look at what we can change in the browser while an AR scene is running. So now that we have everything set up, we can start adding some commands to our dev tools. So if we just take our cube that is in the global scope and we just translate it by a small amount, you can see that the cube in our 3D scene moves a small amount. And if we translate it in a different direction, it'll move in that other direction. And so this is a good way of getting used to the reference frames that we're using. So if you can see that Y is up and down and Z is backwards and forwards. And once we have these different translations, we can try looking into what a rotation will look like. So you have all your X, Y's, and Z's with that. And one thing that's always interesting with rotations is when you're talking about a rotation in X, do your Y and X axes change during the rotation? Do a bunch in a row, you can see how if you rotated by small increments very quickly, that would look like a smooth animation of a rotation. Next thing we can look at is the different colors that we attach to the materials. So right now we're just using a very basic mesh material. And so we can just change the properties and it'll change in real time. So you can just kind of edit whatever values you want. If we're using a more complicated material, you could change some of those parameters too. But so it's really good for troubleshooting because you can kind of change it to different colors if you're having issues with that. The next thing we can look at is quaternions. So quaternions are the main form of rotation that you have within 3D scenes. And so they're a little bit complex in the sense of they don't really map very well to anything that's regularly used in basic mathematics. So they're actually an extension of imaginary numbers. So they're like more complicated imaginary numbers. So it's a little bit difficult when you first start working with them to understand kind of what different quaternions might mean. I find that just kind of playing around with quaternions and seeing how they interact with one another can be a really nice way of figuring out what to do with quaternions. And then we can just kind of try out some of the basic functionalities of Three.js so we can see what slurps do. So slurps are basically that's moving towards the other quaternion in such a way that it's kind of like smoothly on a sphere. And so that will look like we're just kind of moving really smoothly between these different rotations. And then you can try just kind of seeing what happens when you alter quaternions in a few different ways. The one thing that's important to remember with quaternions is that if they are not unitary, if their magnitude doesn't equal 1, then they end up being a transformation as well as a rotation. So you'll end up with a different size of object and kind of a skewing in some fashion or another. Thanks and have a good day. If you're interested in continuing, I'd suggest as beginner project, either looking into one of the game projects that I've put forward or the GIS one, which is rather straightforward, or maybe even the magnetic fields in AR. Those are all pretty straightforward projects that don't require a lot of extra code. Thanks.